Um, but the history of police violence in Minneapolis, for me anyway, starts with it started way before the 90s. There was problems that the Minneapolis Police Department has kind of been a wild department, like most other departments in the country. The what makes it exceptional is that Minneapolis is known as a progressive and liberal haven. So you would think that the police would be kind of gentler police, the kind of police that the chief talked about in the stay-in, and we'll talk about that. In fact, one of the things I listed, I think it was the last thing I listed, talks about how the hypocrisy of the so-called kinder, gentler police force that we know nothing about. So I started my anti-police violence activism in 1990 when a kid named Tysel Nelson was murdered. And if you come here and you mention that name to anybody over 40, pretty much they know his name, and that would be pretty young. But he's been a rallying cry for a long time because Lieutenant Dan May, who's on the force right now and actually trains people, murdered him, shot him in the back, running outside of a party in the winter of 1990. And me and Chris Nissen, who's one of the best organizers I've ever met in my whole life, one of the most political, clear people I've ever known, who has run into some unfortunate stuff later in life. Me and him pretty much got with a few other folks, Kim Washington and some other folks, and we said, hey, we got to organize and get some justice for this guy. Now, this is the middle of winter in cold Minnesota. Times have changed. We had no internet, no cell phone, and so you had to do things the hard way then. You had to make a flyer, and we had to go door to door. In fact, I think we even got Professor Nims to go door to door with us time to time. Those old days, remember? So we go door to door, passing out, and we built a protest movement, and we fought to get justice for Tysel Nelson, and we failed, but it energized people. It really did, and it woke folks up to this problem because people have been sleeping on it. And not that long after it, we protested the deaths of Smalley and Weiss. These are two older people who were burnt up in their homes as a result of a wrong house raid. It was really gross. And the chief of police at the time really helped us organize. He incited the city when he said they were victims in a war. And really, really cold stuff because these people were in their late 70s, early 80s, and they raided the house with flashbang grenades, and they caught the curtain on fire, and the house caught on fire, and the police didn't watch these people burn. So we've had, that's kind of the history. Police have been brutalizing folks. It's been a long history of brutalization and killing, and starting in 1990. More recently, we had and was it 2000? Ooh, the time is I cannot. Yeah, in 2012, I think, or 13, Terrence Franklin was killed, and the police had come up with a wild scenario on how they killed him. And then not long after that, the next year, so you all heard Jamar Clark, and he was killed literally a block from where I'm sitting now, literally right around the corner from where I'm sitting. They were cleared again. The Hennepin County attorney, who was Amy Klobuchar, who ran for Senate, she actually has a lot of blood on her hands. She actually was, she wasn't the prosecutor then, but Mike Freeman was the prosecutor. And the same thing keeps happening over and over again. They find a way to justify it. And we had, of course, Philando Castile. Now, the Philando Castile case, we were to force the Ramsey County prosecutor to bring charges against his killer, Geronimo Yanez, and he was set free. The jury was the jury was a sad jury. They actually let people on a jury who actually were friends of cops, and so never really had a chance. And the defense's cases, even though Ms. Valerie says that she was satisfied with their presentation, I kind of wasn't. I thought they could have done some things differently. So those are the things that we've had these cases of police violence. So it's nothing new, and we've been fighting, and I've cut my teeth on fighting those cases. And so we come to so in the middle of those fights, early on in the 90s, to kind of appease us activists, the city offered. Well, we actually asked for the civilian review board, and this is important because we actually got a civilian review board, but we did not get subpoena power. But it had the ability to actually people would come and file complaints and that kind of thing. Civilians actually ran it. So over time, the police pushed back and the city pushed back, and they took they wrested control of the review board from the civilians and then made it a police thing. And then eventually they got rid of the civilian review board altogether, and put it in the Civil Rights Department. Civil Rights Department was somewhat effective. They took it from them, and now they have the Office of Police. I always get it, OCPR. I can't remember what that stands for, but it's Office of Police Accountability. And very little police accountability goes on in that. So we built up quite, I think, here we've gotten really used to fighting police brutality. I jokingly say when, we see people come from outside, like Al Sharpton and those other folks, it's like, this is not a small town where people don't fight police violence. We have a history. And when Rodney King was beaten through an inch of his life, we had the second or third largest sympathy protests, solidarity protests rather, here in the Twin Cities. In fact, August wrote about it. Me, Keith Ellison, and Chris Nissen, and a few other folks, and August, we led that protest. We had 7,000 people go to downtown. Now, I mentioned Keith Ellison because you all are familiar with him as Attorney General, right? You're familiar as a congressman. Well, believe it or not, Keith Ellison used to be a revolutionary. He shared me and Chris's and August's ideas for the most part. And, we weren't all Marxists, but he was stomped down revolution. He was right there with us, organizing, right? We were police violence, anti-police violence fights, anti-identification, housing fights. You remember August, right? He was right there with us. And, he was talking about the need for revolution. He was stomped down revolutionary. But we knew something was kind of going to kilter with him, because then he went from talking about being a revolutionary to joining the Nation of Islam. So, he had his little moments with that, which when he decided to run for office, he had to try to bury those times, which was kind of fun to watch him squirm, if you knew about that history. And so I bring him up because he knows our playbook on some level. He went from doing that work, and as a lawyer, he went to representing people. Then he ran the Legal Rights Center, and folks whispered in his ear, hey, maybe you can run. So he became a local representative, and then eventually became a national representative, and now Attorney General. So he knows our playbook. So he said something real interesting. So forgive me if I get all over the place, because I want to make sure I hit on some real important points. When he had to take the case and prosecute this case, he said aloud that it wasn't the protests that caused him to have to take this case, right? Now, he said that because he knows the playbook. He knows that it's absolutely a fact. In fact, I remember at a protest, I took that on. I said, no, then nothing can be further from the truth. It was the protest that forced his hand, right? Because Mike Freeman had made his mind up he was going to take the case and do what he normally does, which is clear the police, which is what that's one of the things that got revealed in the trial as well. That's what the prosecutor does. It was so hard to get police prosecuted, because they take the side of the police. In fact, what they're usually doing is trying to clear the police. So yeah, Keith, when it came, made a big statement. It was on CNN when his press conference. He said it was not the protests that brought him to this point. And it was exactly the protest that brought him to this point. And as y'all know, that George Floyd, the protest following George Floyd was historic because it happened all over the world. In fact, to this date, it's probably the largest protest in the history of protests. That may be wrong, but it's sure the largest protest against police violence, especially when you consider that, every little enclave in the U.S., it's like Podunk, Idaho had a protest, and because I think what happened differently in the George Floyd thing was that everybody saw it, but I think we turned the corner. Everybody was able to see George Floyd's humanity. I think that's what moved people. They saw George Floyd as a real human being, and they identified with him. All right. So there's some real working class solidarity. Speaking of, one of the things that I've been able to do, and Aislinn mentioned my work with families, is several years back. Well, when we're doing the police violence case, as I was, you always wind up working with families, right? In fact, it's not funny, but an interesting thing used to happen in the old days when there was a police violence case. Even if somebody didn't die, I'm talking among friends, so we're gonna tell the whole truth. So the opportunities spring up around this thing, unfortunately, right? Some people get involved because they have some other interests, and we've seen it with some groups now that have banked a whole lot of money. And I'm sure maybe they're trying to do some good, but they banked a whole lot of money, and it hasn't gone to any families for the most part. And so you always have, oh, they do it, and there's all kind of reasons some people come to these fights. And so I remember me and Chris sometimes having to compete with the opportunists, like to get the family attention. So it's like you knew you had to go get the family, because if the opportunists got the family, they were going to mislead them and water down the whole struggle. We saw that happen once, and it happened one time to us. So that's not going to happen to us again. And we always got the family and to talk to the family, told them who we were, and that, listen, what you got to do is fight for prosecution. And the family almost always listened to us and agreed, and we would go in the same direction. And so as a result of doing all that work, I began to realize that we really had to put the families in the center of this movement. We can get all the actors and community members around, but the families represent the moral center of this thing, right? You can't argue with the families. They've lost someone. You can't argue with somebody who's lost, and I began to realize that the more we put the families out, it's more people began to see and understand just how real this is, because these families suffer, and when I say family and family, not just the mother or the father or the spouse, whatever, the whole family suffers when they lose somebody from police fire. So several years ago, when the Super Bowl was here, we did a conference called the Take a Knee Conference, where we brought families from all around the country. Worked with Aislinn doing this, Brock Satter in Boston, and Brian Taylor in Cincinnati, and some other folks from around the country. And we brought a group of folks, Dorothy from Chicago, and a few other folks from Chicago, Aislinn, and they told their stories, and it was powerful. And it reinforced for me that we really got to put these families out front, because when the families tell us, you can't argue with them. When you see the families, that this issue of police violence is very real. So what we did following that, on the tail of George Floyd being murdered last July 6th, after we'd done the Take a Knee conference, last July 6th, we organized a Mother's March and conference, and we raised money and brought in families from all over the country. We had over 100-some families here. Pretty powerful stuff. We got them together, and we raised 3 demands, as we did before. That is that the police be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, to jail the killer cops, and that we reopen all the cases. We've been running that demand for a while. In fact, you hear the group Family Supporting Families here raising that demand all the time, that the cases be reopened. We think there's a very radical demand, because it really puts the pressure on the system. To reopening the cases is a significant thing, but it's not unheard of, because for those who remember, at the end of the freedom movement, there was a demand to reopen the cases, and because the system felt so much pressure, a certain amount of pressure, they actually did reopen some of the cases. And some people say, well, they can't reopen all the cases, and that's true. Like in the case of Philando Castile, that would be considered double jeopardy. But we could have the feds charge Geronimo Yanez and look at this case, because he surely violated Philando Castile's civil rights. I mean, that's obvious that he did. So anyway, so those are our demands. And our third one was that we end the system of policing as we know it. Instead of, defund the police. And, I'm not opposed to all that. But at the end of the day, this system, the problem is a system of policing. And I think over the year in this fight to get justice for George Floyd, I think we were able to really bring that to the fore. If you notice, we had a group here, Black Vision Collective, that advanced that idea. But but they only had like 1 or 2 protests, and the vast majority of protests raised the demand for prosecution. Right. And then lots of folks were talking about this as systemic, whereas, there was a kind of initially y'all saw on TV, kind of a dog and pony show going on about the city council talked about disbanding the police. And all of you notice it's kind of dissipated. Right. Because they really didn't mean their heart's just not in it. The mayor's heart's not in it. And so what we have now is that nothing's really moved. Right. After all the smoke, nothing's really moved. And so I think we were right, and one thing we always do is demand that the police be prosecuted, because at the very least, if we can hold them accountable on that level, it at some point protects folks while we're making a demand, and it also puts more pressure on them. Though while the trial was going on, the New York Times recorded that about 62 people were killed by police, so there's still this pushback going on. But we think it's still important that you raise the demand of prosecution. That leads us to the trial, in which I thought what was interesting about the trial, we wrote a lot about it, which is that what the trial revealed, I think, was that I thought it was a bit of a show trial because both sides tried to propagandize folks. If you notice, both sides made a big deal about saying that the police weren't on trial. And they tried to make Derek Chauvin the sacrificial lamb for police violence in this country. Right. But just the opposite happened. I mean, I wrote a piece about, I had everybody laughing when I said, when the chief took the stand and talked about this kind and gentle and loving police force. And I made fun of him. I wrote a story going, the chief describes the department unrecognizable to Minneapolis. Because nobody knew anything about this kinder and gentler police force. These guys let me tell you something too. In the midst of all this stuff going on, all this attention, right, on the police were still brutalizing folks. There was an incident in North Minneapolis where they grabbed the wrong kid for carjacking, and the tensions are heightened. Kids are like, "We ain't taking this off y'all." So folks are ready to go toe to toe. And so instead of the cops backing off, a bunch of young kids had surrounded the cops because they grabbed the wrong person. The kids were trying to tell them, "You got the wrong person." Their parents are coming. So there was jawing back and forth. And so the cops decided they had enough, and they attacked this one kid, just like they've been doing. They attacked him, real cowardly, threw him on the ground. One big cop jumped on him and started punching him. And so, we confronted the police chief. So what are you going to do about this, right? So I think he kind of semi-disciplined them. But the point is that it's something we got to discuss, that, this is still continuing. And I'd be interested to have a discussion about why people think, that even though we push back on police violence, the police are still doing what they've always done. In fact, speaking of Malcolm X, I've been interviewed a few times by these liberal reporters who want to put words in my mouth. And they say, "Well, Mr. Reeves, hasn't there been progress?" And I go, "Well, not quite." Well, they passed this and they passed that. I go, "Yes, but not one single municipality in the U.S. has a mechanism to hold the police accountable if they hit somebody with that stick." You know what I'm saying? I'm not aware of one municipality where they're saying that if a cop mistreats a citizen, we're going to send him home. And if he does it twice, we're going to fire him. That's real accountability. And that doesn't happen. Malcolm X said, "Listen, if the knife is in my back and you only pull it out 6 inches, he says, that's not justice. You pull it out 3 inches, it's still not just. If you pull it all the way out, it's still not just." He says, that justice will be when you pull it out and you clean the wound. In our case, real progress would be if the police are actually being held accountable. And that's just not happening. It's not. They've talked a lot about it in Minneapolis. They talk so much about it that people started to believe that something really happened. But nothing significant has happened. So I'm going to end with this. One of the things I thought was significant about the trial is, of course, you saw what happened around the trial. The city tried to do what I said, violence bait us, and try to make us into the criminal when, they try to flip the script. They had actually been the criminal and try to make us, the victim, appear to be the criminal by putting up barbed wire fence and razor wire and all this craziness. And I called it out. But during the trial itself, I think the trial revealed, while they were saying it wasn't about U.S. policing, it revealed the problem with the U.S. police, because Derek Chauvin had 26 complaints before he murdered George Floyd. You mean, you couldn't call him in after 26 complaints that, some kind of alarm wouldn't go off? Chauvin actually was a trainer. So it exposes that, rather than them actually wanting to discipline these guys, they're promoting these kind of folks. I think it also revealed that these holes, these chokeholds, these knee and neck, that's part of police procedure. So while they were saying, "Oh, this isn't an indictment of police," they indicted themselves, because the trial revealed that this is standard procedure. Also revealed that when people say they can't breathe, the cops are taught and trained to ignore that. They're saying, if you can breathe, if you can talk, you can breathe. And of course, that's not medically true. And so several people have died, actually, who's saying they can't breathe because the cops have ignored it, because they're actually trained that way. Some liberal folks always talk about, "Oh, the cops, we just do something about the training." Well, this is where they would have a point. If they stop training the cops to believe that somebody saying they can't breathe can breathe, that may save some lives. Also, I think they expose the role of medical examiners. In a lot of these cases, the medical examiners have lied, right? They've changed. They've come up with conclusions that have supported the police and the ability for the police to get off. Also exposed this whole idea of police killing people under the guise of excited delirium. So this is another thing that came out. in the trial that this is a real thing. You know, people thought, oh, that can't be true. It can't be real. But excited delirium is something that the police are taught, that people get to the point where they have inhuman strength, mainly talking about black folks, and then the cops have to like really rev up to deal with them. Anyway, so rather than so the trial, I think, actually did put the system of policing on trial. So there's other things that I'd like to discuss around what happened here, like because somebody was asking me a lot about it, so we should discuss it at some point. I think it's interesting what's going on with Ben Crump and Al Sharpton. And I think on some level they're a bit of a hindrance. But to Crump's credit, at least he does support the idea of activists fighting for justice or fighting for prosecution in these cases. So I'm gonna end with that. I just wanted to kind of do a recap of things I thought were important. And on his anniversary again, I think that we have we made some progress. I think more people see this as seriously take this seriously, but bureaucratically and fundamentally, there's been no real progress, in municipalities as far as saying we're going to hold police accountable. There's a lot of talk about it, but they literally have not held police accountable. And so because of that, I said nothing's really changed.